Hello, curious minds. Welcome to this intellectual journey. Today, we're not going to talk about the well-known battles, those of steel and gunpowder. Instead, we'll dive into a much quieter war, a war for the soul of a continent, a war of books and ideas that shape the future of millions. We've all learned about the arrival of the conquistadors in the Americas, ships, crosses, swords. But have you ever truly wondered what was lost? I'm not just talking about lives or gold. I'm talking about entire universes of knowledge, libraries that burned to ashes, and voices that were almost entirely silenced. The question that will guide us today is devastating. How do you narrate the end of your world? What words do you use when you see your gods die and your culture vanish? This is the story of those who lost the war, told by themselves in the fragments that survived the fire and oblivion. It is the story of the vanquished voices. Before we begin, I wanted to tell you a bit about the images you'll be seeing. To bring this narrative to life, I've used AI tools to generate the visuals. So think of them as a canvas, a way to illustrate the ideas and atmosphere of what I'm sharing with you. They won't always be an exact or literal representation, but rather a visual accompaniment to let your imagination soar with me. I sincerely hope you enjoy it. To grasp the sheer scale of this tragedy, we must first erase the image of the primitive indigenous person. Mesoamerican civilizations like the Maya and the Aztecs weren't just great architects and astronomers. Above all, they were people of the book. They held a profound respect for the written and recorded word. Their books were called codices. Imagine an accordion made of deer hide or amate paper, a type of bark. In them, they didn't just write with letters, but with a complex system of images and glyphs, symbols brimming with meaning. Every color, every figure, every position on the page told a detailed story. These codices weren't mere stories. They were the hard drive of their civilization. They contained their history, from the creation of the world to the genealogies of their kings. They also recorded their scientific knowledge, their astonishingly precise calendars, their medical treatises, and even their tax records. Losing a codex wasn't like losing just any book. It was like erasing a part of an entire people's collective memory. It was an act of forced oblivion. And that's exactly what happened. The conquistadors, in their zeal to impose a new faith, saw these books as a direct threat, a heresy that needed to be purged. One of the most tragically famous events was the Auto de Fe de Mani, Act of Faith of Mani, in 1562. There, Friar Diego de Landa ordered the burning of an incalculable number of Mayan codices. He himself wrote, with a chilling detachment, that he burned them because they contained nothing but superstitions and falsehoods of the devil. Imagine the horror. It wasn't just the burning of paper, it was the burning of identity. It was telling an entire people that everything they had been, everything they had believed, and everything they had known was worthless. It was an act of cultural genocide, an attempt to reduce the spirit of a people to ashes. But here, right in the heart of destruction, something incredible happened. Human memory is resilient. When paper burns, history takes refuge in the minds of the elders, in the songs of the priests, and in the hearts of the wise who survived. Memory refused to die. And then a new kind of literature was born, a clandestine literature and emergency literature. It's what scholars call trauma literature. It wasn't writing to celebrate, but to remember. Not to govern, but to survive. It was a desperate attempt to save a soul from shipwreck. The surviving indigenous wise men realized they had to adopt the tools of the conqueror to save their own legacy. So they learned the Latin alphabet, and in secret, they began to transcribe their ancient stories, myths, and memories using the very letters of their oppressors. It was an unprecedented act of cultural resistance. The most powerful example of this is the Popol Vuh. It's often called the Maya Bible, but it's much more than that. It's the Book of Counsel, a sacred text narrating the creation of the world and the adventures of the twin heroes Hunahpu and Xbalanque in the underworld of Xibalba. The version we know was written around 1550 after the conquest. It was written in the Quiche language, but using the Latin alphabet. The author is anonymous, likely a Christianized Maya noble who wanted to ensure that the knowledge of his ancestors wouldn't be lost forever. The Popol Vuh tells us that the gods attempted to create humanity several times. First, they made men of mud, but they dissolved in the rain. Then, they made them of wood, but they had no soul and didn't remember their creators. They were clumsy and empty, a failed first draft of humanity. Finally, on the third attempt, the gods found the perfect material. They created human beings from maize. Maize, which is the foundation of life in Mesoamerica, also became the flesh and blood of the people. That's why, according to the Popol Vuh, humans are men and women of maize. This act of writing the Popol Vuh wasn't just an exercise in memory, it was a political declaration. At a time when they were told their gods were false and their stories were lies, An anonymous author was carving out the deepest truth of his people in a new format. He was saying, "We exist. This is our story. This is our origin." But the Popol Vuh wasn't the only one. In the Valley of Mexico, Nahua wise men, the heirs of the Aztecs, also fought to preserve their memory. Their songs and poems, which were once recited in ceremonies, were now transcribed in secret. These texts are known as the Cantares Mexicanos, Mexican songs. In these songs, we find some of the saddest and most beautiful verses in world literature. They are elegies, laments for the lost city of Tenochtitlan. One poem states, "On the roads lie broken darts, our hair is scattered. The houses are unroofed, their walls are reddened." It is the direct testimony of an apocalypse. Another poem asks, "Where are we going? We have only come to be born. Let me go where there is no death. Let me go where victory is found." This is the philosophy of trauma, the search for meaning amidst absolute meaninglessness, a question hurled into the void after your universe has completely collapsed. Now here the story becomes even more complex and fascinating. Sometimes the Spaniards themselves became the archivists of the worlds they were helping to destroy, not always out of kindness, but out of necessity. To convert the indigenous people, they first needed to understand them thoroughly. The most incredible case is that of Fray Bernardino de Sahagún, a Franciscan missionary. He spent nearly 50 years of his life in Mexico, learning Nahuatl perfectly and interviewing the elderly wise men who still remembered the world before the conquest. He was a kind of accidental ethnographer. Sahagún gathered his indigenous informants, who were nobles and priests, educated in the ancient tradition. He asked them questions about their gods, their rituals, their society, and his informants not only answered, but also drew, creating illustrations in the old codex style. The result is a monumental work, the Florentine Codex. It's a 12-volume encyclopedia on Nahua culture. The astonishing thing is that it's written in 2 columns, one in Spanish with Sahagún's version, and the other alongside it in Nahuatl, with the direct testimony of the indigenous informants. When reading the Nahuatl column, we hear the vanquished voice directly. When they describe the arrival of the Spaniards, they don't speak of gods. They use words like demons or barbarians. When they narrate the massacre at the Templo Mayor, the text conveys a pain and horror that Sahagún's version softens. The Florentine Codex is a paradox. It was a tool created for colonization, to understand the other and thus better dominate them. But at the same time, it became the Noah's Ark of Nahua culture, the most complete time capsule we have of their world. A double-edged sword that unintentionally preserved what it aimed to transform. Think about it for a moment. These texts, born from the deepest pain, are fundamentally hybrid. They use the conqueror's alphabet to save the conquered's words. Sometimes they are written by indigenous hands, sometimes by Spanish hands transcribing an indigenous voice. They are the first fruit of a violent encounter. This forced mixture, this clash of 2 universes, gave birth to a new way of seeing and telling the world. A sensibility where the mythical and the real are not separate. Where ancestors walk alongside the living and omens are read in the flight of a bird. A worldview that had been erased from Europe centuries ago. This is the key point. The wound of the conquest, the trauma of broken memory, didn't disappear. It lay dormant in the cultural subconscious of Latin America. It was transmitted from generation to generation, not only in texts, but in oral histories, beliefs, and rituals. Literary historians have studied how this vision of the vanquished became the secret DNA of Latin American culture. It's a perspective that understands power, not from the king's throne, but from the people's resistance. A memory that knows the official story rarely tells the whole truth. And this is where history takes a leap of almost 400 years and connects directly to our present. For centuries, this way of narrating the world remained on the fringes, viewed as folklore or superstition by the dominant culture, which tried to imitate Europe. But in the mid-20th century, something changed. A group of Latin American writers decided to stop looking to Europe and start looking inward, to the deep and complex roots of their own continent. Writers like Miguel Ángel Asturias, Alejo Carpentier, and of course, Gabriel García Márquez. What they found was precisely this worldview born from the trauma of the conquest, that reality where the magical and the everyday seamlessly intertwine. They called it magic realism or the marvelous real, and they weren't inventing it, they were rediscovering it. They were drawing from a very, very ancient well. When you read in 100 Years of Solitude that a character ascends to heaven in body and soul while folding sheets, or that an insomnia plague causes people to forget the names of things, it's not just an author's fantasy. It's the direct echo of a worldview where such events are possible. It's the echo of the Popol Vuh. Magic realism, which astonished the world and earned Garcia Marquez a Nobel Prize, is in essence the vision of the vanquished finally finding a universal voice. It's proof that the memory they tried to burn in the 16th century survived, transformed, and finally blossomed for the whole world to see. Thus, trauma literature wasn't an end, but a beginning. It was the painful birth of a new identity, an identity that is neither purely indigenous nor purely European, but something new, mestizo, and complex. An identity that learned to live with its ghosts and to tell its stories from the wound. Therefore, when we read these testimonies, we're not just doing literary archaeology. We're connecting with the origin of a way of feeling and narrating that remains alive and vibrant in Latin America today. In its music, in its art, and of course in its literature, the history of the conquest of the Americas, seen from this perspective, ceases to be a simple chronicle of victors and vanquished. It becomes the story of a memory that refused to be erased. It's a reminder that you can burn books, but you can't burn stories as long as someone remembers them. Next time you think about the conquest, don't just imagine ships and cannons. Also imagine an anonymous wise person, by candlelight, using the alphabet of their enemies to save the soul of their people, letter by letter, in an act of love and resistance that resonates to this day. It's fundamental to understand that this literature isn't a mere collection of myths. For the peoples who created it, it was their truth. It was the explanation of the cosmos, the guide for their moral behavior, and the record of their lineage. Destroying it was like ripping out a culture's operating system. Let's consider Nahuatl poetry. It had a concept called flower and song. For them, poetry was the only way to speak the truth on earth, the only path to connect with the divine. So when we read their poems of lament, they aren't just rhetorical devices. They are the failure of the highest truth they knew. Trauma also manifests in silence, in what goes unsaid. Many of these texts have gaps, logical leaps. Scholars believe these are a form of self-censorship. Indigenous scribes knew that if they revealed certain secrets of their rituals, they could be persecuted by the Inquisition. This literature also shows us a clash of concepts of time. For Europeans, time was linear, an arrow moving forward. For many Mesoamerican cultures, time was cyclical. They believed in eras that were destroyed and reborn. Some saw the conquest not as an absolute end, but as the end of a cycle, however painful. Even the way history was narrated was different. Spanish chroniclers sought a single authoritative narrative. Indigenous accounts, like the Annals of Tlatelolco, often present multiple versions of the same event without necessarily stating which one is correct. It's a more collective and less dogmatic view of memory. This is crucial. The loss wasn't just of stories, but of ways of understanding reality. Western culture tends to sharply separate the natural from the supernatural. In indigenous thought, this separation is much more fluid. A hill can be a deity, a dream can be a real message. That's why magic realism isn't fantasy. Fantasy creates impossible worlds. Magic realism describes a world where the impossible is part of its character's everyday reality. It's a direct inheritance of that worldview that refused to accept the categories imposed by European thought. The testimonies of the conquest also reveal profound technological and military bewilderment. They describe horses as giant deer and cannons as fire trumpets that shot stones. It's the language of astonishment trying to process a horror unprecedented in their experience. Furthermore, disease played a terrifying role. Smallpox, brought by the Europeans, decimated the population who had no defenses. Indigenous texts describe the plague with gruesome detail, like an invisible and monstrous force against which their rituals and medicines were powerless. The figure of the translator or interpreter, like the famous Malinche, is incredibly complex in these texts. For the Spanish, she was an indispensable ally. For many indigenous texts, she is an ambivalent figure, sometimes seen as a traitor, sometimes as a forced mother of a new mestizo nation. The trauma of broken communication. Consider the book Chilambalam, another Maya text written after the conquest. It's full of prophecies and lamentations. One of its lines reads, "The time of lies has come." It perfectly encapsulates the feeling of a people watching their conception of order and truth replaced by another, imposed by force. The final irony is that many of these texts, created to preserve indigenous memory, were discovered and valued by Europeans centuries later. The Popol Vuh, for example, was transcribed and translated by Friar Francisco Jimenez in the 18th century. It remained lost in archives until much later. This belated rediscovery meant that indigenous communities themselves often lost access to their written heritage. Today, there's a strong movement of reappropriation, with indigenous scholars and leaders translating these texts back into their original languages and reintegrating them into the lives of their communities. So what do these vanquished voices teach us today? They teach us that history is a battleground of narratives, and that the version imposed as official is rarely the only one that exists. They invite us to always seek the other column, the other voice, the story that was silenced. They also remind us that culture is far more resilient than we believe. It can be wounded, traumatized, forced underground, but its essence can survive in the most unexpected ways, like a seed waiting beneath burned earth to sprout anew. The concept of trauma here is key. Studies in psychology show that unresolved trauma is transmitted across generations. In the same way, the cultural trauma of the Conquest has left an indelible mark on the collective psyche of Latin America, manifesting in its social, political, and artistic tensions. That's why reading the Popol Vuh or the Cantares Mexicanos isn't an act of nostalgia. It's an act of healing. It's recognizing the original wound to understand the present. It's giving those voices the space and dignity they were denied 500 years ago. Next time you hear about the discovery of the Americas, question that word. A discovery implies finding something unknown or forgotten. But the Americas were neither empty nor forgotten. They were full of people, cities, and above all, stories. It wasn't a discovery, it was a covering up of one world to build another on top. Language matters. Calling these voices vanquished is accurate militarily, but perhaps imprecise culturally. Because although their armies fell and their cities were destroyed, their words, their worldview, and their memory survived the catastrophe and, as we've seen, ended up influencing the entire world. In summary, the Conquest was a double tragedy: the visible tragedy of physical violence and death, and the invisible tragedy of epistemicide, a term meaning the systematic destruction of a people's knowledge. The burning of codices was the central act of the second tragedy. However, from the ashes of that knowledge emerged these hybrid texts, these trauma literatures. They are the first expression of what we today call Latin America. They are neither completely indigenous nor completely European. They are something new, born of pain and resistance. They are the testimony of incredible survival. The existence of these texts challenges the simple narrative of total victory and absolute defeat. It shows that dialogue, even if asymmetrical and violent, did exist, and that the culture of the conquered infiltrated that of the conqueror, creating a cultural fabric that is unique in the world. In the end, these voices force us to be humble. They remind us that our way of seeing the world isn't the only one, that other ways of conceiving time, community, nature, and the sacred existed and still exist, and that in the diversity of these visions lies invaluable richness for all humanity. Let's consider that the word book itself is insufficient. In Nahuatl, the word for these objects was amoxtli. This term didn't just imply the physical object, but also the knowledge and power it contained. To lose the amoxtli was to lose the guidance and legitimacy of power. Orality also played a crucial role. Long before being written, these narratives were memorized and transmitted orally through special schools called Calmecac for Aztec nobles. Writing was a support for memory, not a substitute. That's why songs and poetry were so important. This oral origin explains the repetitive and rhythmic style of many of these texts. Phrases and structures repeat like in a song, which facilitated memorization. It's a characteristic that survived even the transcription to the Latin alphabet, giving it a unique and powerful cadence. Think about the impact of paper. European paper was different from amate bark paper. The quill pen was different from the rabbit hairbrush. The simple adoption of new writing technologies subtly altered the way thought was recorded. Form and content are always connected. Colors were also a language. In pre-Hispanic codices, red could signify blood or power, yellow gold or sun, blue water or divinity. Much of this language of colors was lost in the alphabetic transcriptions, which were primarily in black and white. Another layer of meaning erased. It's important not to idealize the pre-Hispanic world. It was a world with its own wars, hierarchies, and systems of oppression. The Aztec Empire, for example, dominated other peoples. In fact, the Spanish exploited these internal tensions, allying with peoples subjected by the Aztecs to achieve the conquest. However, the violence of the European conquest was of a different scale and nature. It didn't just seek to subjugate for tribute, as pre-Hispanic empires often did. It sought a total transformation and cultural and religious assimilation, which made it existentially far more devastating. And here we arrive at the deepest twist in the story. The survival of these voices didn't just influence literature, it changed the very definition of what it means to be American. Latin American identity cannot be understood without this indigenous substratum, without this memory of trauma and resilience. It's often thought that indigenous culture is something of the past, something found in museums. But these voices prove otherwise. It's a living current that continues to flow beneath the surface of modernity, and which constantly emerges in art, politics, and spirituality. Contemporary authors, many of them writing in indigenous languages, are continuing this legacy, no longer from clandestinity or emergency, but with pride and a will to reclaim their place in the canon of universal literature. The literature of the vanquished now speaks with a new and strong voice. That's why this story isn't just about the past. It's about the future. It's about how societies deal with their histories of violence and how marginalized voices find a way to speak and rewrite the narrative. It's a lesson in cultural survival that's relevant to any part of the world. The fact that today we can read the Popol Vuh online or analyze the Cantares Mexicanos in a university is the result of an almost miraculous chain of survival. From anonymous scribes, curious friars, patient archivists, and modern scholars who dedicated their lives to listening to these voices. So the history they tried to erase wasn't entirely eliminated. It was wounded, fragmented, buried, but it didn't die. It survived in the cracks and the margins, waiting for the moment to be rediscovered. And in doing so, it offers us a more complete and honest vision of who we are. The conquest of the Americas was, without a doubt, an event of immense brutality. But the history of the literature born from it is one of the most compelling proofs of the indomitable capacity of the human spirit to create beauty from pain and to find a voice even in the midst of the most deafening silence. This literature is a mirror. It forces us to confront the darkest parts of our history, but it also shows us the incredible strength of human creativity. It teaches us that to build a just future, we must first have the courage to listen to the voices of the past, especially those that were silenced. The war for memory never ends. Even today, throughout the Americas, there are struggles for land, for rights, and for the recognition of indigenous cultures. The battle that began with the burning of the codices continues, though it is now waged in courtrooms, classrooms, and media. The legacy of the vanquished voices is, therefore, both an invitation and a responsibility. The invitation to explore one of the world's deepest and most moving literatures, and the responsibility to ensure that these stories, which survived so much, never again run the risk of being forgotten. So, as we've seen, the history of the conquest isn't written solely with the ink of the victors. In the shadows, in the margins, in an act of supreme defiance, the vanquished also took up the pen and wrote their own version. A story not of gold, but of maize, not of distant kings, but of nearby gods. They created a literature that was not a trophy of victory, but an anchor for memory, a refuge for the soul of a people facing the end of their world. These texts are proof that even when all is lost, stories can save us. And that memory, that trauma transformed into art, didn't stay in the 16th century. It traveled through time, transformed, and became the seed from which magic realism would sprout, one of the most important literary currents of the 20th century. A final proof that no voice truly dies as long as someone listens. The history they erased didn't vanish, it was just waiting for us to be ready to listen to it, and to understand that the true wealth of the Americas wasn't the gold they took, but the stories that remained. Next time you read a Latin American author, try to hear the echoes. The echo of the lament for Tenochtitlan, the echo of the twin heroes descending into Xibalba, the echo of the men and women of maize. The history they tried to erase is alive, and now you are also a part of its memory. I hope this journey through the forgotten voices of the conquest has been as fascinating for you as it was for me. It's a topic that teaches us about the fragility of culture, but also about its incredible power of survival. Literature sometimes is the most powerful weapon. We've traveled a long and sometimes painful path, from the ashes of the Maya codices to the magic of contemporary literature. We've seen how a wound can become a source of creation and how memory refuses to be buried. History, as you see, always has more than one side. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive. Your time and curiosity are the driving force behind this channel. Learning together and questioning what we know is the goal of every video we make. Truly, thank you for being here. If you enjoyed uncovering this other side of history, subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next journeys into the secrets of literature. Your support allows us to continue creating rigorous and passionate content like this. And now I'd love to read your thoughts in the comments below. Were you familiar with these texts? What other erased history or silenced voice would you like us to explore in the future? Discussion and the exchange of ideas enrich this entire community of curious minds.